Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everybody. So, once again, continuing our discussion of non Western traditions. Today, we're going to be looking at Oceania and Australia, as well as pre Columbian America, so Native American peoples and things like that. So, once again, we got a lot to cover in today's video, so I'm going to go kind of fast, so bear with me on that. But jumping right on in. So, Oceania is a term that refers to the collective name of the thousands of Pacific islands comprising Polynesian culture. So, as we can see, it's a very, very wide, diverse region of the world. It's made up of all these little islands out in the Pacific Ocean. And so, there's a wide variety of different cultures at play here. However, there are some overarching themes that we can talk about. So, Oceania is settled by migrants from southeastern Asia over a period between roughly 26,000 BCE and 800 CE. So it's one of the last places in the world that really becomes inhabited by people. So most of the rest of the world is inhabited much before this, even the Americas. But the artworks of Oceania are kind of tough to generalize because of the diversity of cultures, environments, and raw materials that are available. But we'll see that there are some common factors that kind of overarch a lot of it. But we'll also see that oceanic peoples make a wide use of things like wood, tree bark, feathers, bone, shells, and basically anything that they can get their hands on. But as such, these artworks tend to be somewhat rare in that they're made of perishable materials again, and there's no real stone or metal work being done here. There is some stone work that happens, and we'll see that, but there's really no metal work that takes place in this region. But we also have to think about the rarity of this being based on its location. So a lot of these islands that are inhabited are very small atolls or sandbars, essentially, out in the middle of the ocean. And so if a hurricane or a typhoon comes through, many of these islands can be basically wiped clean, and any and everything that was on them is just gone. So a lot of the artwork that we have from this culture really dates between the 18th and 19th centuries, when European sailors begin to come into contact with them, and they trade for goods and all kinds of stuff like that. So a lot of the artworks from Oceania tend to be much more recent, and also as such, because they might be found on an island that was deserted, a lot of them don't have a whole lot of cultural context behind them, or at least we're not aware of that context, because once again, the people just are simply not there to provide it for us. So some of it, once again, can be kind of tough to generalize. However, there are several beliefs that offer a kind of commonality between these disparate sources. So, according to various mythologies, the world was created by the union of the Earth Mother and the Sky Father. And so, accordingly, this union creates all life forms. And so, you'll see this kind of connotation of the Earth Mother, which is usually represented by a snake, and the Sky Father, which is usually represented by a bird. So birds and snakes are very common motifs in a lot of this artwork, and we'll see some of that as well. But ancestors are also considered to be intermediaries between people and the gods. So we'll see that very much like in African artwork, like the kind of portrait heads that we saw, that ancestral veneration or worship is going to be very prevalent as well throughout many of these different cultures. So many of the artworks made by these cultures are done in order to placate our ancestors, or to not only worship them or honor them, but also to get them to help interact or interfere in human affairs, so that from the spirit world, they're helping to influence daily life and all of these kinds of ideas as well. So one of the other major aspects that permeates a lot of this oceanic artwork is the idea of mana, and this is a kind of spiritual power. We could think of it being very much like chi coming out of Taoism. We can also think of mana being similar to the Shinto religion of Japan, in that all things are considered to possess mana, or this spiritual energy, if you will. So mana can reside in not only people, but places and things. So many of the artworks from this region of the world are not only meant to possess mana, but are also perhaps meant to control or influence mana in one way or another. And so we'll see some examples of that. So many art forms that are intended to possess mana, or many of these art forms are intended to possess mana in order to keep adversity at bay, promote community well-being, and enhance personal power and wisdom, things like this. So mana, aside from this idea of Earth Father, Sky, or I'm sorry, Earth Mother, Sky Father, are kind of, very common traits in a lot of this kind of artwork. So we begin with the Solomon Islands in Melanesia. And so if we're looking at all of Oceania here, we can see it's really broken down into three major zones. So we have Melanesia, which incorporates, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, places like Fiji, all of these kinds of places. Then we also have Micronesia, and we have Polynesia, which comprises places like Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, and places like this. So we're going to start with Melanesia. And one of the more prominent aspects of Melanesian art that we see are figures such as this. And this is what's known as a protective prowhead figure. And this is not only a utilitarian object, but it's also a spiritual object as well. So if we're looking at this, we can see a little bit of, similarity to some of our African influence, or at least our African masks and things, in that we have this kind of elaborately elongated and exaggerated depiction of the human form. But we can also see, like that, we have a wide variety of decorative elements which are meant to show certain tribal allegiances. So whereas in Africa, scarification tends to be more prevalent, in Polynesia, tattooing is much more prevalent. So in this particular case, we can see, this figure has shell inlay to mimic his facial tattooing. And this would not only show us, what tribe he aligned himself with, but it would also show us his prowess as a warrior. So, you actually have to earn facial tattooing and stuff like that in many of these cultures. It's not something that you can just have because you want it. So once again, this would show, a certain individual, the more tattooing we had, the more prominent they would be, all of this kind of thing. But we can also see, once again, shell inlay in the eyes to create this nice contrast between the dark wood and the eyes there. But we can also see, elaborate jewelry, so we can see very elongated earlobes with those gauges in there. But we can also see, a nice headdress and everything like that. Now, that would tell us a lot about who the people using this are. So it would be able to tell us, who this group actually was. Because this figure would be situated at the front of a war canoe, and we'll see a picture of that here in a second. So not only does it act as a kind of, it acts to stabilize the canoe in the water, but it would also, tell others who we were, kind of like a battle flag, if you will. But we can also see elements that are meant to echo this idea of spiritual power, mana. So we can see that the figure is holding a bird in their hand. So this is a reference to that Sky Father once again. But this is also a kind of good luck omen, because if we think about rowing a canoe on the open ocean, seeing a bird is a very welcome sight, because it tells you that land is nearby, and that you're kind of not doomed out in the open water and everything like that. So you'll see birds represented in many of these kinds of representations as well. But if we look here, we can see how it would actually be utilized. So here we can see one such figure, once again, showing a variety of different, kind of cultural elements to the group itself. But we can see that it's situated right along the water line of this canoe. So it would not only help to stabilize the canoe in the water, but it would kind of break right on the surface. So it would be kind of like a terrifying aspect if we were going, or at least meant to intimidate, if you will, anyone that we might be going to war with, everything like that. So it has very utilitarian kinds of functions, but it also has more spiritual kinds of connotations as well. Now, another aspect of artwork that comes out of this Melanesian area is, mask work as well that serve ritual functions. And I think this is probably one of the more interesting ones. So this is what's known as the New Ireland mask from New Ireland and the Solomon Islands. But this is a mask that's meant to control this idea of mana. And interestingly, this is a mask that's meant to remove bad mana, and so this elaborate work of art is created for one singular use, and then it's meant to be discarded. So it's meant to take on someone's bad mana, their bad spiritual energy, and then we are to remove it from society and get rid of it so as to get rid of that bad energy. So I find that to be interesting. But if we look at it, we can see a wide variety of different, kind of cultural aspects. The entire mask itself is meant to hearken to this idea of the Sky Father, in that we have, a kind of human form, but we have these stylized wings on either side. We have a bird on top of the human form itself, but then in the wings, we can also see this kind of union between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, in that we have these birds on each wing that are holding snakes in their mouths. So once again, birds and snakes, very common representations in many of these art forms. But we can also see, once again, this kind of use of tribal tattooing, piercing, and everything like that. We can see that this particular image is meant to be ferocious looking, because once again, it's taking on this kind of bad energy and everything like that. But once again, I find it interesting that someone would go through all of the trouble to very elaborately carve this and decorate it, and it's only meant to be used in one ritual sense and then discarded so as to get rid of that bad energy. Now, if we move on to places like Micronesia and Polynesia, we start to see a wide variety of different kinds of carvings as well. Not just masks, we see much more figurative kinds of carving in this region. Once again, all of this is very, very rare. Many, these aspects, especially works like this, really, we don't really know what they're meant to represent specifically. We can really only guess and speculate at it. Because once again, many of these items are, found without any kind of, cultural reference from the peoples, and things like that. But what we see here is thought to be a female figurine. It's thought to be female because of the kind of protrusion on the chest there. But this comes from Nokoro Atoll, so this is a very small sandbar, kind of island out in the middle of the ocean. But once again, this was found long after the island had been abandoned, so we have no real context for it. But it's thought that this would probably be used in some form of ancestral worship, to placate our ancestors or to venerate our ancestors that had come before us. Many Polynesian societies, unlike Western, kind of European civilizations and things like that, tend to be a little bit more focused on matriarchal types of, societies and organization. So that's a kind of an interesting aspect as well. You will see quite a bit of male figures, but you'll also see quite a bit of female figures, kind of in this similar vein as well. But what I find interesting is that this entire thing, which has this very smooth mirror-like finish to it, is also carved without the use of metal tools whatsoever. So this was all made either with stone carving tools or sand to polish the surface, and then natural oils and things like that. So very, very kind of interesting aspect there. But once again, this is probably thought to represent some kind of ancestral form. But here we can see another example, this time a male figure from the Caroline Islands. So a little bit different culture, but we can see, once again, these carvings in this region of the world tend to be much, much more simple than elsewhere, given the fact that we don't have metal tools, which makes it much more difficult. but they still do have a really nice level of descriptive quality to them. We get the sense for this individual probably has a beard or a goatee of some kind, but we can also see the use of shell inlay for the eyes in this case. But once again, this general kind of elongation or, kind of abstraction of the human form is going to be very, very common in most of these as well. But once again, this is probably made mostly out of stone tools and things like that. So it's pretty remarkable considering the quality of the surface quality of this as well. But that brings us to probably one of the most interesting and most well-known examples of carving within Polynesian culture in particular. And those would be the moai, which we see here from Easter Island. And what's interesting is that not only are these meant to be representative of kings that have come before us, they're also meant to be kind of a form of ancestral worship, but they're also meant to be protection kind of entities. So many of these sculptures, all of them are larger than life size, are kind of situated along the coastline of Easter Island. And in order to kind of stave off, the kind of brutal, weather conditions surrounding the island, it's a very isolated island about 3,000 miles off the coast of South America and everything like that. But some of them are rather elaborate. Some of them, such as we see here, have elaborate headdresses in association with them as well. Many of them are also placed on these kind of large plinths, if you will. And everything like that. But interestingly, the construction of these moai is actually what brings about the destruction of the Easter Island civilization. And that, as we can see, the island behind us in this image is fairly barren. There aren't a lot of trees. However, originally it would have been heavily forested, and it's thought that the Easter Island people actually deforested the entire island in the creation of these moai sculptures. And this brings about a very large-scale ecological disaster in which they basically remove all of their food sources because of erosion that takes place after deforestation and everything like that. And in fact, many of the moai that we know of today are buried because of erosion due to landslides from this deforestation process. So some of them are actually really, really massive. In fact, here we can see one that was dug up. This one is over 70 feet tall. And once again, very, very large scale. But it's been buried because of landslides due to soil erosion over time. But what I also find interesting about many of these is that they actually have a kind of proto-pictographical language carved on them. So it's not just the heads. It might be hard to see, but his arms actually extend and he's got hands on the front. If we looked at the back side of this particular one, he's also got a kind of stylized loincloth and some hieroglyphic-like carvings on there. Now, because the Easter Island people died out pretty much before European contact with them, we still don't know how to read that language. But it is an interesting, there's a kind of proto-written language that is still yet to be deciphered, if you will. But these are really the only known stone construction or carving in Polynesian culture. Very, very rare in that regard. Once again, most of these, these carvings are going to be made out of wood or other perishable materials. And it is also important to note that this was all carved with other stones. So they would use a harder stone to kind of chip away at this volcanic stone that these are actually made out of. So kind of interesting there. But if we move on from Easter Island, we also see that the Hawaiian Islands have a variety of these kind of carved figures as well. Here we can see what's known as the Akuma figure from Ford's Cave in Hawaii. And what's interesting, this is actually made out of koa wood. Koa wood is a natural kind of hardwood that's native to the Hawaiian Islands only, and it's a very difficult wood to carve. But considering that, the fact that it was carved without, metal tools and it was polished to such a high degree of quality is quite remarkable as well. But what we see here is once again also thought to be an ancestral figure. I was found within a cave So this would probably be a ritual site where offerings would have been made. But we can also see the addition of a variety of different materials being used in this as well. So not only do we have the koa wood being used, but we have shell inlay in the eyes, but also in the teeth. We also have coconut fibers, which are being added to create the idea of hair within this as well. But once again, we can see this kind of simplification and exaggeration of the human form being very, very prevalent. In Hawaiian depictions, especially, you tend to see these kind of, oval linear forms quite a bit, which we can see present throughout this female figure as well. So once again, very, very common. But aside from that, we also have a variety of other kinds of artworks. Once again, usually made out of natural materials. Here we can see a feathered image mask. This is also made out of or using shells and teeth and other kinds of materials. But this would also be a kind of mask that would be used in for ritualistic purposes. In fact, I've seen images from the early 20th century where they have, a few hundred of these masks all at once. But just consider how many, kind of tropical birds we would need to get all of the feathers for these kinds of masks. But this is kind of a kind of a demon-like mask. It's very ferocious looking, but it would serve certain connotations within this as well. But once again, a lot of this kind of artwork before the 19th century especially is very rare because it just doesn't survive. A lot of what we do have is basically through trade with European sailors and things like that. So they're bringing these objects back and, all of this kind of stuff. But if we move on to Australia, Australia has some similarities to, some of these ideas permeating, oceanic cultures, although it's going to be much, much different or a little bit more different. But some of this idea of like ancestral worship is still very common. But human inhabitants of Australia dates back to 40,000 BCE, roughly the end of the last ice age, so when there was still a land bridge connecting Australia to Asia. But before the arrival of Europeans, native Australians maintained a very intimate bond with nature. And in fact, native Australians, or the Aborigines as they're known, never really left the semi-nomadic lifestyle of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So until much more modern times. So Aboriginals see themselves as having this kind of bond between themselves and nature, as this kind of close relationship established by creative beings in the mythical or eternal dream time. So this whole idea of the mythical or eternal dream time is very prevalent in a lot of Australian Aboriginal artwork. And so here we can see one such example. A lot of, Aboriginal artwork takes two major forms, either petroglyphs or like rock carving or painting, or bark cloth painting. And that's because as a nomad, you have to carry everything with you. And so it can be very cumbersome to carry a bunch of stuff with you if you're always on the move on foot. So a lot of their artwork takes the place or, takes the form of petroglyphs, such as we see here. This is, kind of meant to represent various human forms in this mythical time. So we see this kind of spiritual light or whatnot coming forth from their eyes. But once again, very, very heavily, kind of exaggerated in their abstract qualities and things like that. But what I also find interesting about many of these petroglyphs, and here we can see these are petroglyphs of various fish. This is actually coming from Uluru, the large red sacred rock in the Australian outback. But many of these petroglyphs would be a kind of proto-pictographical language as well. So many of them are situated at places where water can be found, where abundant food can be found. And so we as a traveler could see this and we would know, okay, well, there's good game to be had in this area, or we can replenish our water supply, etc., etc. So it begins to convey, information beyond simple depictions. It almost becomes a type of written language in and of itself. in that regard. So I find that to be kind of interesting. But aside from these kind of pictographical or petroglyph carvings, one of the other major aspects of Australian art is what's known as a bark cloth painting. And so bark cloth is very common not only in Australia but all throughout the Polynesian cultures, oceanic cultures as well. But it's a type of cloth that's made by taking thin layers of tree bark and pounding them out very, very thin and kind of layering them up almost like a type of paper. However, it's much more sturdy than paper. But a lot of the images that we see in these kind of paintings convey a variety of information, usually related to this spiritual world or our journey throughout that spiritual world. So what we see here, this is actually a bark cloth painting depicting funerary rites. So what we see here is actually a depiction of the soul of an individual departing its body and making its journey into the afterlife, if you will. So if we see on the left here, we see a pyre, and this is, the actual like physical remains of the individual, but the individual's spirit is being conveyed right here to the afterlife by this large serpent, if you will. And so the serpent is kind of ushering him into the afterlife. But on either side, we can see that he's being, kind of echoed into that world by song and dance. So we can see two prominent individuals here playing the didgeridoo. We can also see individuals dancing on either side. And this is a kind of song and dance that's meant to kind of help usher forth or usher him into the afterlife as well. But we can also see in the bottom corner down here, the same individual, the spirit of the man, and he's captured a very large fish. So he's captured, food and provisions that he needs for his journey into the afterlife as well. So once again, it's kind of an interesting little series of vignettes that are meant to convey a passage of time as well as the passage of the spirit into the afterlife, if you will. So very interesting. A lot of these bark cloth paintings also tend to be very abstract as well, even in terms of only representing, geometric patterns. So this is actually a little bit more on the rare side, given that it has actual kind of figurative representations. Many of these just have, patterns that are also meant to convey certain information as well, and we would be able to read that as such. Now, moving on from there, we move into native North America. So native North America, prior to the conquest of Europeans, is a very diverse region, obviously we have two continents full of a wide variety of different tribal allegiances, peoples, and, all of this. And it's all going to vary somewhat, but we're going to focus a little bit more on some of the main aspects of the continental United States and then the pre-Columbian civilizations as well. So we begin with the Hopwell culture, and this is a kind of blanket term for a variety of Mississippian cultures in this general region of the United States or the modern day United States. But this is an area or a culture that really flourished in and around Ohio, especially between the 2nd century BCE and the 6th century CE, so about an 800-year period. But what the Hopwell culture is really well known for is these large-scale mounds that they build. And this is probably one of the most famous or most well-known, and this is what's known as the Great Serpent's Mound. And this is from the Adena culture. I believe this is in present-day Ohio or Illinois. But as we can see, it's a large earthenwork mound that is meant to represent the form of a snake. And so many of these mounds either will represent, animalistic forms. This isn't the only one, but this is the most well-preserved one. Many of them have become obscured over time or built over. Many of them were also deliberately destroyed at certain times in the past as well, unfortunately. But once again, this would have probably served as a kind of religious center for the people involved in this. So this would probably be a site that they would come to on, a fairly regular basis in order to, do rituals or ritual dance, all kinds of things like that. But once again, this is not the only one of these mounds. I have another example. This is what's known as the alligator mound. It might be kind of difficult to see. It's not as well preserved as our last one, but we can see the tail coming down into the body and the head, and then the limbs coming off there on the side. But these mounds are built by essentially stacking up rocks and, you know, covering them in dirt and then covering them in sod on top of that. But it's not just animal mounds that we see with the Hopwell culture. In fact, we also see large-scale pyramid-like mounds in this culture as well. So this is what's known as Monk's Mound from the Hopwell Mississippian culture, and the city center of what's known as Cahokia in modern-day Illinois. And this is the largest pyramid within the continental United States, or pyramid-like structure. But what's interesting is that, you know, Monk's Mound would have been the center of Cahokia for religious practice, and at its height, it would have supported, or the city would have supported, somewhere around the line of 300,000 people. So this would have been a massive city complex originally. Unfortunately, only, you know, the main mound kind of survives today, but we can see just how sprawling it would have been based on archaeological evidence in the area. So here we have just a kind of recreation of it and everything like that. But this civilization begins to decline in the 1300s, roughly the medieval period, and then by the time Europeans come into North America, it's very much long gone. But it's a kind of interesting, less well-known aspect of Native American culture within the United States. Now, aside from the Hopwell culture, we also have a wide variety of Pueblo cultures in the Southwest. So these cultures are really well known for, not only their pottery, but also their weaving as well as their architecture. I don't have pictures of the Pueblos that they built, but I'm sure you've seen those you're in your own time and whatnot. But each Pueblo, it's important to note, kind of has their own style that they would go about, but they have, once again, overarching themes once again. But what the Pueblo peoples are really well known for is their weaving, and so they're really well known for blanket weaving, in particular the Navajo tribe. And so here we can see what's known as a chief's blanket. This would have been a very prominent kind of artifact within the culture, so only prominent individuals would be able to really wear this. But what's interesting is that these are made out of wool, so natural wool, but they're woven so tightly that they're actually waterproof, despite being made out of wool. But we can also see a major aspect of these Navajo blanket weavings is that they're using these very bold geometric colors and patterns. So you'll always see them using black, white, blue, and red exclusively. However, the patterns that we're going to use are going to vary depending on what specific tribe within the Navajo or Pueblo peoples that we're going to be using. So we can see this one is very kind of linear in its design. However, we also have some that take on this kind of eye blaze pattern or eye dazzler kind of pattern. So they make more geometric kind of use and everything like that. But once again, we can see that red, white, black, and blue are going to be the main colors used in most of these. Now, aside from their blanket weaving, the Pueblo peoples are also really well known for their pottery and their basket weaving. In fact, they can weave baskets that are so tight that they can hold water without leaking and things like that. But here we can see an example of a jar coming from the Acoma Pueblo, so one of these other Pueblos. But we can see how rich it's decorated. They also usually make a very heavy use of geometric design motifs. And once again, these designs would have certain connotations to each individual tribe. So we can see different kind of emblems of tribal affairs. I believe this kind of, swirling pattern that comes through is also meant to echo the idea of the Milky Way and other things like this. So once again, many of these aspects have symbolic connotations to certain natural phenomenon, the natural world, the spirit world as well are quite common. Tribal allegiances, all kinds of things like this. Now, aside from that, one of the other major aspects of Pueblo culture is what's known as the Kachinas, and these are the kind of life spirits of many of the Pueblo peoples, in particular the Zuni and the Hopi peoples. And this takes a kind of variety of forms. Here we can see the major Kachinas. These are kind of the deities or spirits, if you will, but they're venerated in a variety of ways. So, one way that they're usually represented are through these small dolls. So here we can see one such, a Kachina doll, but this is made from terracotta. They usually also have a variety of other elements in them as well, like feathers, painting, beadwork. Sometimes they're made out of, more perishable materials, such as cloth and feathers and things like that, and not out of ceramic ware or terracotta such as we see here. But once again, these are used for votive kind of practice or honorific practice. But they also take the form of ritualistic costume and dance as well. So here we can see a photograph from the early 20th century of Hopi people in Kachina outfits using these outfits, kind of similar to African dance and African masks, for these kind of ritual dance purposes as well. Now, aside from the, Hopwell culture and the, kind of Pueblo peoples that tend to be more sedentary, we also have a wide variety of cultures that are nomadic throughout the Plains region of the United States, in particular here in Texas and Oklahoma, Kansas, these kind of regions. But I like to show this image. This is actually a European, or early American painting of a Native American. But I think it's important to show to make a point about certain stylistic, practices within Native American culture. So if we look, this is Matatope or Forebears. He was the second chief of the Mandan people. So the second chief, that means that he was the war chief. So he was kind of the general of the tribe. But I like to show this because of his elaborate feathered headdress. And I think it's important to note that not everyone could wear feathers in Native American tradition. I feel like Hollywood has done a bad job of showing everybody wearing all these feathers, and this type of headdress has been kind of appropriated in a variety of ways that mislead its actual connotation. But in order to wear feathers in many of these Native American tribes, you had to earn the right to wear these feathers. And the main way that you would earn feathers in most of these tribes would be through the practice of counting coup. And depending on what tribe we're talking about, there are a variety of ways that we can count coup. It usually involved either laying your hand on a living enemy and then, returning alive or unscathed. It might also, be, charging their position without being scathed or injured, stealing their horses, and then sometimes even more extremely through the use or through taking of scalps and things like that. But we can see, obviously, Matatope here being the war chief of the Mandan, very, very prominent individual. And so he earned the right to wear all of these feathers through his exploits in battle. So very, very kind of a prominent individual. And once again, I feel like most people don't understand the connotation to, having to earn the right to wear these feathers. However, once again, being a nomadic society, many of the Plains Indians' artwork are going to be much more utilitarian in origin. However, we do have an interesting aspect of what are known as, robe paintings. And so these are made out of buffalo skins. But here we can see the robe of Matatope. So the individual that we see here, we can see this is his robe, which is meant to depict his coup or his war deeds. And so we can see his counting of Ku represented by his feather count here in the center, but we can also see depicted all around it various, kind of prominent exploits that he would have been known for of achieving in his lifetime. And so what's interesting is, once again, we can look through and we can see this as being a record of his exploits within the tribe and within his life and everything like that. So it's a kind of written record, even though they don't have a written language. But these robes kind of vary depending on what tribe we're talking about. Some of them show the counting of Ku. Others show prominent, kind of events or aspects of the tribe's life. I've seen some of them that represent, each year they would paint a different thing for, the most prominent, kind of thing that happened that year. And sometimes you'll see outbreaks of disease or, conflict with certain groups or, prosperity or blah, 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 whatever. But some of them, they vary quite a bit. And here we have just another example, this time coming from Shisapa. This is a Sioux warrior, but this is his robe painting of his war exploits. But what I find interesting is that we can see a United States cavalryman depicted here in blue pants. And so this starts to show the conflicts between the Plains Indians and the kind of early United States in the middle of the 19th century there during the Plains Wars and after the Civil War and everything like that. So once again, these can convey a wealth of different information as well. Now, aside from these kind of robe paintings, a lot of Native American, Plains Indian, artwork is much more utilitarian in function, such as we see here. A lot of it is very heavily adorned in beadwork. And what I find interesting is that these beads are traded from quite, far away many times. There are, examples of Comanche beadwork from Texas and New Mexico that are using shells and beads that are made from, sources coming from the Great Lakes up north and everything like that. So these people are trading very extensively, but this beadwork also tends to show a very wide variety of cultural information as well. So we would be able to see what beadwork or what patterns are being used in the beadwork, and then we would know to whom that person belongs, tribally speaking, and everything like that. But one of the major aspects of beadwork, or at least the motifs within it, is the Thunderbird. And so here we can see a Sioux papoose board. This would be used to swaddle a young or an infant while a woman went about her, kind of daily tasks. But if we look here, we can see the stylistic representation of the Thunderbird running down the center of these kind of red and green geometric motifs here. So all of these motifs would indicate that this is Sioux in origin. However, we do see that the Thunderbird motif is used throughout a wide variety of different cultures. So it's not just the Sioux using it, but it tends to kind of take on a very simple geometric kind of connotation rather than a more, a more figuratively representational kind of look like the robe paintings do. So beadwork tends to be much more geometrically simplified. However, it's not just utilitarian objects like this. We also have a wide variety of beadwork within clothing, and once again, this beadwork would be meant to show not only one's tribal allegiance, but one's importance within the tribe. So, the chief or the medicine man would be more prominently decorated, all of these kinds of things. But here we can see just a nice example, this time coming from the Blackfoot tribe. They're kind of an offshoot of the Sioux, or they're kind of warring with the Sioux quite a bit. But once again, very, very elaborate. Many of these types of, tunics or garments would be worn more for ceremonial purposes rather than everyday purpose. So some of them also get into the realm of costumes for dance, ritual dance, and all of this kind of stuff as well. Now, moving on from there, we also have pre-Columbian Central and South America. So, In this sense, there were a variety of cultures that flourished in pre-Columbian America before the arrival of the Spanish. So many of these cultures were influencing each other through not only trade but through warfare. So quite extensively there, but many share a variety of cultural forms, especially in Central America, especially. But we'll see that things like pyramids, colonnades, or I'm sorry, calendars, and many of the same important gods and things like that are all commonly shared elements, not only between the Maya, the Aztec, the Toltec, etc., etc. However, our discussion of pre-Columbian America really needs to begin with an unknown civilization that originates at the city known as Teotihuacan. And Teotihuacan is about 40 miles west of modern day Mexico City, and it's one of the most massive kind of city complexes in Mesoamerica. But it's very important because many of the cultures that come later will look back to Teotihuacan as their kind of genesis point. So it's from Teotihuacan that the civilizations like the Toltec, the Aztec, the Maya kind of look back to as being their originators, if you will. But here we can see a grand kind of processional road where all of the main temples at Teotihuacan are located. And if we look just in the background there, we can see the Pyramid of the Sun. And this is a monumentally important structure for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, this is the largest pyramid in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, this is the largest pyramid in the Americas. It has a base the same size as the Great Pyramid of Giza, although it's not quite as tall as the Great Pyramid of Giza. But this pyramid is built over a cave system in which the peoples believed that the sun first emerged from the underworld, and so it has massive cultural connotations, and not just for the people who built it, but the Aztecs especially will later look back to the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan as a very sacred location. It's only, once again, about 40 miles away from their main capital city, Tenochtitlan, which we'll see here in a few minutes. But once again, massive structure. It's known that sacrificial rites would have taken place here, human sacrifice, all kinds of things like that. But it is dedicated to the sun god because this is the site where the sun is said to have been born from the underworld. So it's very, very important. But if we look at it compared to the Great Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt, we can see it has the same size base. It just is not quite as tall. It's about half as tall. But in that regard, it's probably about as big as the Step Pyramid. Maybe a little bigger in terms of its footprint, but it's probably about the same height as the Step Pyramid at Saqqara there. But once again, this is the biggest pyramid in the Western Hemisphere. But at Teotihuacan, we start to see a lot of motifs that will predominate or, kind of be referenced in not only, Toltec, but Aztec and Maya work, all kinds of different work. And one of the major aspects of this is the feathered serpent, or what comes to be known by the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl. So we'll see this idea of the feather serpent being referenced time and time again. We'll see a variety of examples of it today. But here we can see this is the Temple of the Feathered Serpent at Teotihuacan. But we can see the kind of serpent head with these feathers radiating out from back there. And so once again, we can also see it in bands around the side here. And so this feathered serpent is a major deity in most of these pre-Columbian civilizations. You'll see it echoed in the pyramids of the Maya, in the Aztec, etc., etc. We'll see a bunch of it. But once again, this is probably one of the most common design motifs within pre-Columbian civilization. Now, Teotihuacan is at its peak at about 600 CE, but is theorized to have been the sixth largest city on the planet at that time. So it would have had a population of hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, it would have been bigger than most European cities at that time. But it was abandoned after a fire destroyed much of the city in 750 CE. So it's abandoned. Its people disperse and begin to form other cultures at large. But once again, all these other cultures are going to look back to Teotihuacan as their kind of genesis point. So that brings us to the Maya. And the Maya are very interesting in that they are the only pre Columbian civilization in the Americas to develop a written language. So we can actually read and understand the Maya today. But they also developed an elaborate calendar, advanced mathematics, large scale pyramid complexes. They're very well known for their astrology or astronomy, I should say. So their priesthood could actually predict astronomical events like, solar eclipses and things thousands of years in advance, and they took advantage of that. But they also develop a written language. Here we can see one example. This is what's known as the Yucatan Codex. This is one of 20 such kind of pamphlet-like things that very narrowly survived the Spanish conquest. Most of this material was deliberately destroyed by the Spanish, and this was also very nearly destroyed during World War II, as these are housed in Germany currently. But it's from these codexes that we're able to translate the Mayan language, and we're able to read their thoughts and all of their hieroglyphics and whatnot. So it's very, very interesting there. But once again, the Mayans actually develop a quite an elaborate calendar. This is the Mayan calendar. Don't be fooled. The other calendar that usually gets mistaken for the Mayan calendar is the Aztec sunstone, which is not really a calendar in and of itself. It has similar connotations, but it's not the same. But what's interesting is that the Mayan calendar is actually, divided into 12 Baktums or cycles. And so I'm sure you saw a few years ago in 2012, everyone was freaking out because the 12th and final Baktum was coming to an end. And so, everyone thought, oh, it's going to be the end of the world. But that's not the case, because the Maya, very much like Asian traditions, view time as cyclical. And so it's not that the world is coming to an end. It's just one cycle of time has come to an end. And we're now technically in the 13th Baktum. And so we're in a new cycle of time, if you will. But I've always found that to be kind of interesting. But once again, the Maya also developed large-scale pyramids. Here we can see one of the major pyramids at what's known as the city of Tikal in modern-day Guatemala. But, this is a ritual sense, unlike the pyramids of Egypt that are used more for tombs and burial places. These pyramids are more temple-oriented. And so we can see the temple situated up here at the top. And this would be a very exclusive location. Only the high priesthood and the royalty could actually enter into the temple space. But it's in this space where sacrifices would be, taking place. And depending on what God we're, praying to or what we're trying to achieve, these sacrifices might take different forms. So it's not always full-blown human sacrifice. Sometimes it's just a little bit of bloodletting. So we might cut ourselves and, drain a little blood, or we might sacrifice an animal, or, what have you. It varies depending on what we're trying to do or what we're trying to achieve. But it's not just, massive pyramid structures like this. We also have very large, elaborate structures. This is actually the Royal Palace of Palenque, another major Mayan city-state. So this would be the royal residence of the kings of Palenque. It's important to note that the Mayan civilization, very much like the Greek civilization, is made up of smaller city-states and not a really unified empire or anything like that. But once again, we can see elaborate, architectural work. There are many of these sites that are still yet to be found because they've been overgrown by thick jungle. In fact, a few years ago, I think an 8-year-old kid found a completely undiscovered Mayan city on Google Earth which is pretty interesting and everything like that. So, you could go search through Google Earth and perhaps find some major archaeological kind of site, if you will. But Mayan artwork is usually what we have left is carved work. So they have a lot, they're really adept at relief carving. Here we can see one such relief. This is meant to be representative of a king giving out judgment. So we can see the king represented here, very elaborately adorned in jewelry and headdresses, and he has two attendants on either side. We can also see hierarchical scale is very prevalent in Mayan artwork. So the more important an individual, the larger they are depicted. We can also see the Mayans, especially the royalty, tend to have this kind of sloping cone-like head. And this is due to the practice of head binding. So this would be something practiced by royalty to set them apart from common people. So they would have this kind of elongated head that would be shaped in infancy and everything like that. But we can also see the addition of Mayan hieroglyphs. These would be used to tell us who this specific king was, the date that this is taking place, etc., etc. So similarly, we also have, these scenes that depict a royal life and royal ritual. This is a particularly interesting one, in my opinion. This is what's known as Lentil 24 from Yaxalan. But this is actually depicting a bloodletting ritual between the Mayan king, Lord Jaguar Paw, and his queen, Lady Zoc, who we see here on the right. And so this is actually meant to be taking place inside of one of those sanctuaries at the top of this pyramid complex. So we can see that Lord Jaguar's shield is actually holding a stylized torch to illuminate the space. And his wife is actually passing a rope with small shards of obsidian glass attached to it through her tongue. So she is ritualistically spilling her own blood in order to give as an offering to the gods. Now, we might think that this is rather barbaric or brutal, but, the king would actually perform this exact same ritual, except instead of passing the rope through his tongue, he would pass it through the foreskin of his penis. And so it's not always good to be royalty. But once again, this is something that each one of these individuals would have done on a yearly basis. They would have considered it their supreme honor and duty to do this, and everything like that. So it's not just common people that are making sacrifices or slaves that are being ritualistically killed. It's all aspects of Mayan civilization or society are making these kinds of sacrifices as well. So that's quite interesting. But once again, we know who these are. We know that this took place in October of 709 CE based on the writing in the hieroglyphs around that as well. But the Mayans would have also originally been well known for their mural painting. Here we can see the actual interior of one of those temples at the top of a pyramid. But they would have all been very elaborately decorated. Even the pyramids themselves would have all been whitewashed in lime plaster and then very heavily painted at one time. Unfortunately, that just doesn't survive to this day because of the humid climate. But here we can see a surviving example of Mayan fresco painting, and this is meant to depict a ritual kind of dance or procession of musicians. So this would be in the lead up to the sacrifice that would take place in this particular temple space and all that. However, aside from carved and painted artwork, the Maya and indeed many pre-Columbian civilizations are really well known for their jewelry work and things like that. So unfortunately, most of that was destroyed by the Spanish after the conquest in their search for gold and things like that. However, here we can see an interesting surviving example. This is the funerary jewelry of King Pakal I, one of the more prominent Mayan kings. But this is all jewelry and a kind of mask that he would have been buried in. So it's all made out of jade and turquoise. So kind of interesting there, but once again showing just how elaborate some of this would have been. They would have also made very heavy use of gold as well. But we can also see here, we can see the lid of Pikal's tomb, so where his jewelry was found, and it shows a variety of different aspects. I've also seen this is, you know, heavily featured in the Ancient Aliens shows, where they're trying to claim that this is some kind of spaceship, but that is, sorry about that. But that is not what is happening here. This is actually a depiction of Pikal's passage from the physical to the spiritual world. So what we see is Pikal himself in death here, and coming forth from him, he's kind of situated on this altar, and this is meant to represent the god of death, or the god of the underworld down here, and his wings are kind of coming up to embrace him. But we can also see the tree of life spurting, kind of coming forth from Pikal himself, so as to kind of represent his spirit leaving his body, if you will. And up top we can also see the feathered serpent, you know, kind of ushering him into the afterlife as well. So once again, the feathered serpent, very prominent motif even in Mayan art and architecture as well. Now, from the Maya, we also have a kind of interesting intermediate, you know, civilization between the Maya downfall and the rise of the Aztec, and that is the Toltec, who were very prominent between the 9th and the 13th centuries in modern-day Mexico. So the Toltecs are really considered to be the precursor to the Aztec. In fact, the Toltec the word itself, comes from the Aztec Nahuatl language and means artisan. So the Aztecs actually look back to the Toltec for inspiration quite a bit, and the Toltecs themselves are looking back to Teotihuacan, the Maya, etc., etc. But so they form a bridge between the decline of the Maya and the rise of the Aztec, and they, you know, made some innovations in architecture as well as in monumental sculpture. So the Toltec are really well known for one site in particular, and that is Tula in modern-day Hidalgo in Mexico. But they're really well known for these Atlantean figures. And so these are massive, larger than life-size stone warrior columns, and these would have originally held up the roof of this temple structure atop one of these pyramids. But once again, this is a aesthetic that is very heavily copied by the Aztecs later on. Now, unfortunately, a lot of Toltec artwork is very, very rare. It's really only known from a few or a handful of sites. A lot of it, too, was destroyed by the Spanish. In fact, most Aztec and you know, artwork and all of this is very, very rare because a lot of it was just looted and deliberately destroyed after the Spanish conquest. But we can also see that it's the bird, or the Toltecs give rise to the notion of Quetzalcoatl, as it comes to be known in the Aztec language. But this is once again an homage to the feathered serpent. So here we can see a Toltec representation of the feathered serpent in this case. But we also see that the Toltec also begin to use a lot more animalistic kinds of representations, and in fact we see one of the very first examples of a emblem that comes to be synonymous with Mexican culture itself. So here we have an eagle devouring a serpent, and this is actually said to be how the Aztec come to choose the location for their capital city, is that they witnessed an eagle devouring a serpent on top of a cactus, and therefore they built Tenochtitlan in that location. So we see that kind of motif being much more prevalent. Once again, this is interesting because human representations tend to be a little bit more prominent in the Americas, whereas animal representations tend to be more prominent in the old world. But we do have quite a bit of animal representations that start to come into play within this kind of context as well. Now, another major aspect of Toltec artwork is what's known as a chukmol, and this is a kind of ritual sacrifice altar, if you will. They're very, very common. They usually take this humanoid form, such as we see here, and usually this would be situated at the top of a pyramid structure, such as we see here. But this would be a place where offerings would usually be laid, and then many times would be ritualistically burned as well. So oftentimes we would place our sacrifice on the center here. It might be blood, it might be human organ, it might be a variety of different things. And then we might also ritualistically burn it so that the smoke would convey that sacrifice to the spirit world and to the gods and everything like that. So once again, another major aspect of Toltec artwork. This is also heavily, kind of carried over into Aztec aesthetic as well. Now that brings us to the Aztec, and they are probably, they are the youngest of these civilizations. They really come about in the 1300s and are only really around for a few hundred years before the Spanish completely destroy their civilization. And unfortunately, probably less artwork survives from the Aztecs than any other pre-Columbian civilization, just due to the fact that the Spanish were very aghast at how barbaric or how brutal the Aztecs were in their religious practice. So, the Aztecs comprised the most powerful kingdom in Mexico at the time of the Spanish arrival in 1520. Art in many ways is a summation of previous styles, so they're looking to the Toltec, to the Maya, the Teotihuacan culture, etc., etc. But the Aztecs actually called themselves the Mexica, which is where the term Mexico comes from today. But they settled the area of modern-day Mexico City in the 14th century. Once again, it's said that they witnessed an eagle devouring a serpent on top of a cactus, and they chose this site. However, the site that they chose is what comes to be known as Tenochtitlan, and it was originally built on an island in this large lake in what is modern day Mexico City. Nowadays, the lake has been drained and the entire lake bed is modern day Mexico City. But originally, the city center would have been this island, and it was not only the island, but they also made all these artificial islands that they used for agriculture. It was connected to the land by 3 major causeways in which you could line 10 horses abreast and walk down. So very, very massive. In fact, when the Spanish first arrived there, they were just dumbstruck by how elaborate this was. In fact, the city was at least 10 times larger than the city that most of the conquistadors had come from in Spain. They saw it was just otherworldly to them. And they were just awestruck until they reached the city center where the main temple complexes were. And then that's when they become extremely horrified, because Aztec civilization was very heavily predicated on warfare. And a lot of their warfare was designed to capture slaves, to sacrifice to the war and the thunder gods. And in fact, the main pyramid in the center of Tenochtitlan, which we see here in the center, when they dedicated it after its construction, they sacrificed 80,000 people just to dedicate it alone. And it's thought that they probably sacrificed anywhere up to and between 20 and 100,000 people a year on this. So the Aztecs did not have a lot of friends. In fact, the Spanish were able to enlist the help of many of their neighbors who were being used for human sacrifice to help take them down. So it's, once again, we have to think about this from a different cultural context and everything like that. But it's one of the main reasons why the Spanish go about the destruction of the Aztecs in particular. But the Aztecs' principal temple honored the storm god as well as the gods of war, and they made human sacrifices of prisoners taken in battle. This is meant to symbolize the self-sacrifice that the feathered serpent made in mythical time to ensure the continuation of the world. So human blood sacrifice is seen as essential to basically satiate the gods' hunger. So without human blood, the gods would cease to be, and then the world and the universe would cease to be. So it's very important that these blood sacrifices be made. But once again, depending on what god we're talking about, it might not be full blown death, or organs being ripped out, things like that. It might just be simple things. Also, depending on who we are within the context of the civilization, we're going to make different kinds of sacrifices as well. In fact, many people also considered it an honor to be sacrificed in this way. So once again, there are a variety of different things that could take place, but it's believed the original sacrifice occurred at Teotihuacan, which the Aztecs regard as a holy place. Once again, it's only about 40 miles away from Tenochtitlan there. But the feathered serpent was also a major recurring motif in a lot of Aztec sculpture. It's in Aztec, or the Nahuatl language, that the feathered serpent comes to be known as Quetzalcoatl. So once again, very, very prominent motif. Here we can see one such that survived the Spanish conquest. This is a small carved, kind of sculpture, but once again, we can see the feathered serpent there. But it's not just in carving. The Aztecs were also well known for their jewelry and precious stonework. Here we can see this is the mask of Yixuacaltli. Probably butchering that name, but this is the god of fire. But we can see this entire mask is made out of turquoise and other precious stones. So very, very elaborate. They would have also been known for their gold work as well, and everything like this. But here we can see another example of Quetzalcoatl represented in turquoise and other precious stone this time. This particular piece would have been a part of a headdress or another kind of jewelry-like element and everything like this. So it would have been worn by a very prominent individual. But we also have a lot of, terracotta pottery work from the Aztecs. Here's an interesting example that survives that is kind of akin to this whole warrior idea within Aztec society. So this is meant to represent an eagle warrior. So this would be the kind of tippy top of, Aztec society. So if you were an eagle warrior or a jaguar warrior, you were kind of the high up within the culture. You would have been nobility, all of this kind of stuff. But they would literally wear these kind of eagle costumes or jaguar costumes in battle and everything like this. But here we see that represented. So they're not just doing precious stonework, they're doing a lot of ceramic work as well. But here we can see the Aztec sunstone. This is kind of a calendar. It's used to mark astronomical events, although it's not a calendar in the same way that we think of. But this is often kind of misconstrued for the Mayan calendar. I've seen that done many, many times. But once again, this is meant to represent different aspects of the year, or the solar year, if you will. So this would track solar eclipses and other astronomical events such as that, which would have been very important. Now, from the Aztec, our other major civilization is the Inca. The Inca Empire, also a fairly new civilization, comparatively speaking, compared to, say, the Maya and whatnot, but it incorporates much of Western South America and everything like that. But this is also a civilization that was very heavily distraught by the Spanish conquest, and so most Incan art was in the form of gold as well as tapestries, which did not survive the Spanish conquest. So when the Spanish invaded Cusco, the kind of Incan capital in Peru, they took the Inca emperor hostage, and the Inca emperor went into his throne room, which was roughly the size, or about half the size of a football field. And he said, if you release me, I will fill it this, and he reached his hand as high up as he could. He said, I'll fill it once this high in gold and twice this high in silver. And he did it as just tons of gold. and the Spanish still killed him anyway, and they plundered all of this gold. Most of it was melted down and shipped back to Europe. So not a lot of Incan artwork really survives to this day, unfortunately. But we do have some examples. Here we can see what's known as an octopus frontlet. This would have been the front piece for a kind of headdress that would have been worn by a very prominent individual. This also has connotations to the Incan sun god as well. And everything like that. But if we look here, we can see an example of how one of those frontlets would be worn. So we have some, kind of rare examples of Incan jewelry. But once again, everyone in Incan society would have had access to gold as well. It has connotations not only to kingly power, but to the sun deity and other deities as well. So it's very, very common. Once again, the Inca Empire pretty much made the Spanish Empire wealthy, even more so than the Aztecs. But unfortunately, most of this jewelry just does not survive to this day. However, nowadays the Inca are really much more well known for their masonry and so their stonework. And in fact, they're really well known for these kind of soft joints. But their stonework is so precise that you can't even stick razor blades between it now. So here we can see an example of just how precise this stonework was. And it's important to note that this was all done with stone tools as well. This was not done by aliens by any means. It's just time and patience and persistence. But they're able to, do some remarkable things with it. And perhaps one of the most well-known examples of Incan architecture is this site. This is known as Machu Picchu in present-day Peru. It's actually located about 8,000 feet above sea level on this mega massif here. If you want to go today, I think it's like a 3-week hike through the jungle even to get there. It's very, very remote. But this would have originally been a retreat for Incan royalty to kind of get away from everything. And as a result, and being overgrown by, jungle and everything, it wasn't rediscovered until the 1930s. But if we look at a close-up here, the entire, site is actually a self-contained city. Not only do we have royal palaces, but, temples. We also have homes, which we see here, and a huge amount of terraces, which we see in the background and the foreground here. And these would be used for growing agriculture. So we would actually farm these terraces to provide food for the settlement itself. So kind of interesting there. Well, once again, most Incan art and architecture was physically destroyed by the Spanish, for a variety of reasons, mostly selfish. But if you go to modern day Peru, a lot of buildings are actually built out of repurposed Incan stonework and things like that, unfortunately. But that being said, to end us off for this lecture, I'd like to touch on the Nazca, and these are one of the more interesting kind of aspects of civilization in South America. The Nazca are a people that inhabit a desert-like plateau, and they make these large-scale earthwork drawings known as the Nazca lines. And once again, this is something that's interesting in that they were not really discovered until the 20th century when flight became possible, because from the ground you can't see them. So you can only see them from the air. And so there have been a lot of people that say, oh, these were made by aliens and blah, blah, blah. That's not the case. They're actually very simply made. In fact, if you go to the plateau, you'll see all the dark area in this image is just loose rocks on the plateau surface. And so the rocks are just pushed aside to make these patterns and these lines. But because the area is so arid, there's no rain really they tend to last very well. But it's not just large-scale animal drawings that we see. There are also these huge, kind of long straight lines. Some of these lines are upwards of 10 miles long, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a variety of things. So we have variety of animals, geometric patterns, straight lines, all kinds of things like this. However, these are all used for ritual purposes. So these are actually ritual pathways. So The Nazca people would actually walk along these lines while saying prayers, chanting, doing dances, and it's all in order to placate the gods and ask for rain because they're trying to grow agriculture in a desert, and so rain is very important. And in fact, aside from the lines, their other major innovation is this large scale, series of cisterns and aqueducts and things like that that they're using to collect rainwater in order to grow their crops and everything like this. But aside from some of these, just to end us off, some of the lines are, even more kind of weird. We don't even know what they're supposed to represent. This one is just simply called wings because it's not exactly known what it's meant to represent. But most of the more pictographical ones are thought to be representations of various deities and things like that. So that ends us off for this lecture. And next time we're going to shift back over and start looking at Europe again, but getting more into the modern and contemporary world. So until next time, we'll see you again.